recording live today at Coinbase's State of Crypto Summit in New York City, and perhaps very fittingly, we have Coinbase's Chief Legal Officer here with us, Paul Grewal. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Holly. It's great to be here with you all.
Great to have you. We always start off by asking our guests, what does crypto in America mean to you? And I feel like you'll have a great answer for this.
Well, crypto in America, to me, means freedom.
Yeah.
Plain and simple. Freedom from constraints, freedom from limitations, freedom from governments unnecessarily and unduly burdening, the right of individuals and organizations to transact with one another. So I would say freedom above all other things.
Much different than the last 4 years.
Last 4 years were certainly about much less freer.
Yes.
For sure.
Earlier you did a conversation with David Sachs, the White House AI and crypto czar, and I know during it you mentioned that we're in an unprecedented moment. And it's kind of like about defining what is the moment today. How would you kind of characterize it as the Chief Legal Officer at the largest crypto exchange in the US? And do you think we're actually tapping into the moment correctly?
Well, I think the moment that we're having first and foremost is a moment of opportunity. As we were talking about just a short while ago, it wasn't all that long in the past that for many of us in the industry there was a legitimate question as to whether we would be even allowed to exist here in the United States. And we've worked through the court cases, we've overcome the hostility from regulators, and we're now in a new era where when I walk into the Securities and Exchange Commission, I'm actually allowed to go upstairs and, given the opportunity to make my case to the commissioners and staff who are working hard on sensible rules for crypto. And in between that, obviously a new environment in Washington more generally, on Capitol Hill, at the White House. I think it's a very different time.
And you think the trust is coming back from American founders, other people operating? They feel like they could actually walk into the SEC's office?
Well, I think trust has to be earned. And, for many, the wounds are still pretty fresh, if I'm being quite honest.
Yeah.
One of the points I made a lot in the last 4 years was that too many American innovators, too much American capital was moving overseas because people didn't want to deal with the risk that if they came in and registered, as Gary Gensler used to encourage, their reward for that would be a subpoena on the one hand and a lawsuit on the other.
Yeah. Literally.
So I just think, for a lot of folks, it's going to take a bit more time before they fully trust that they can come in and have an honest conversation without being treated in that manner. But I do think that trust is coming back. And, today's event, for example, I think is a great confirmation.
Yeah, Paul, I want to ask you about that previous period. We obviously had a ton to cover in current events, what's going on now, but you guys were one of the only organizations, maybe you and Ripple, really sort of fought it out from start to finish with the SEC, and you guys obviously didn't shy away from the fight, put an enormous amount of resources into that. What do you think about the tactics? Because I know, and we'll get into legislation and maybe where we go in terms of rulemaking and the future of the SEC. What do you think about the way the SEC approached a lot of those smaller projects who couldn't necessarily fight the fight that you guys could in that time period?
Well, if I'm being completely candid, I thought it was outrageous and atrocious because it was obvious to me that case after case, the goal was never a full and complete airing of the legal concerns that the SEC had with a particular project. The goal was simply to drop a federal lawsuit on a project that might only have one or two founders and a few $1,000s of capital, and essentially to bludgeon them into settling and ultimately submitting. And that's not how American law is supposed to work. People have just good faith disagreements all the time about what a statute means or whether a particular business activity or product or service runs afoul of the federal laws. But the way that those disputes are supposed to be resolved is through good faith arguments before a neutral judge or jury. It's not supposed to be the full authority of the U.S. government being brought to bear on projects that can't respond to that other than by surrendering. And so I think moving beyond that is maybe one of the greatest accomplishments of the last few months than anything else.
Absolutely.
You definitely moved beyond that. We saw a Coinbase lawsuit with the SEC got dropped a few months ago, and then you guys were kind of the first, right? Started the ripple effect, so to speak, and then dropping investigations, dropping other lawsuits in litigation. But you guys did file a FOIA request with the SEC. You have a couple of FOIA requests in which we'll talk about, I'm sure, but this one in particular, Coinbase wants to find out the exact monetary damage of the regulation by enforcement regime. How is that going? Where are you guys with the FOIA request at the moment?
Well, it's going more slowly than I would like.
Okay.
But I tend to be pretty impatient about these things. And we are making real progress, as it turns out.
Yeah.
I mean, look, one of the reasons why Coinbase has engaged in such an aggressive FOIA strategy with a number of agencies, not just the SEC, is that we think, and I personally think, it's really important that we not gloss over what happened for the last 4 years. There was real damage done to real people just trying to start a new enterprise, and in most cases just realize they're part of the American dream. And the way in which the previous administration went about trying to crush that dream, I thought was wrong. Not just illegal, but wrong. And so the way that we avoid that same history being repeated in the future, because of course, governments come, governments go. There could be, a son of Gensler lurking out there somewhere. The way we avoid that, or at least minimize that risk, Kelly, is to tell the story and to get the documents out that show what happened, who was responsible, what tactics they relied upon, and in that telling, hopefully shine a light on how we can avoid repeating that same experience again. And we're committed to seeing it to its logical end, even if with a much more cooperative and productive SEC, things remain relatively slow going in terms of producing those materials. But I think we're going to get them, and I think we're going to be able to tell the story.
Do you feel it's Coinbase's responsibility to shed that light for the whole crypto ecosystem, not just yourselves?
Yeah, I really give a lot of credit to our CEO, Brian Armstrong. It would be very understandable and indeed reasonable for him to say, let's just focus on what Coinbase needs and what Coinbase requires in order to run our business. I think Brian has always, had a view of this company as more than just one actor among many. I think he sees us as a leader and wants us to act as a leader. And so if that means putting some of our resources on issues that go beyond just Coinbase, that really affect many others in the crypto industry in important ways, he's willing to do that. I'm certainly excited to do that, and we're committed to making sure that we see all that take place.
How do you think about it from beyond just this Trump administration into the years beyond that, where we don't know if the next administration is going to be crypto positive, neutral, or negative? How do you kind of think about creating policy and regulation today that will outlast any administration so that the industry can continue to, be innovative?
Well, in order for innovation to flourish, there needs to be stability and predictability. And so, as the CLO at Coinbase, I have viewed my team's responsibility first and foremost as giving our great product and engineering leaders the freedom to operate and the certainty that they need in order to build the next great crypto product or service. I think we are achieving that. There's still a lot of work ahead, and it's way too early to declare victory. But my hope is that we do achieve that in short order with legislation and with good rulemaking coming out of the SEC and the CFTC and perhaps other agencies. And then the way that we make sure that this never happens again, that we have a durable piece, yes, will be through continued work on the Hill and with the agencies, but most of all, shipping great products that tens of millions or hundreds of millions or even billions of people want and need. And that's really how I think we change the game for the long term.
Right.
Yeah, but I want to dig a little further on that sort of regulatory clarity. You mentioned earlier today this difference between rulemaking and legislation. We talked to a lot of our guests about the difference between a judicial precedent and the permanence of legislation versus just rulemaking. And in terms of clarity right now, we're obviously seeing it come out of closure and progress slowly but surely with hiccups along the way through the legislative process. But as far as some of these specific issues go, for things like the definition of mature blockchain, some of those carve-outs, there seems to be a big sort of preference for deference to rulemakers. Do you guys think that in terms of this sort of Gensler 2.0, are we kind of in like a race to the sorting hat here if we get clarity done for all these mature blockchains, and then we kind of hope it works out going into another administration? Or how do you guys think we can get to some real clarity there?
Well, I've always been skeptical that hope is a strategy, or at least an effective strategy.
Agreed.
And so I do think it's important that we have durability, and legislation is certainly the best way to achieve that. But I've always taken the view that regulators have an important role to play in articulating clear standards for this industry as much as any other. And it's important because this industry is changing constantly. The technology changes, the markets shift, and so there's a reason why we have agencies in our federal system. But it's critically important that if the agencies are acting to fill a gap, in terms of rules and regulations, that they act in accordance with the authority given to them by Congress. And so, to my mind, if this Congress or any other says to the SEC or the CFTC or anybody else, go forth and rule make, I have no problem with that if they provide reasonable means and bounds for that. What I think was so outrageous about the last 4 years is, even worse than an agency like the SEC rulemaking without authority, they refused to rulemaking even when they were told to do so.
And then you sued them.
And we sued them, and a federal court of appeals
you were right.
proved that we were right. So I think that less important than having rules come from a particular source or place in the federal government is the idea that that authority be legitimate and consistent with our constitutional structure, and also consistent with what the American public wants. 52 million Americans now have bought or sold a digital asset. I think that number is only going up, and I think the federal government needs to act accordingly.
Yeah.
You guys have several lobbying efforts in DC. You guys are part of the Blockchain Association, I believe, but you also have your own lobbying efforts. You have your own lobbyist in Washington, DC. How do you guys balance, I guess, what's good for Coinbase with what's good for the industry, even when those two things may not necessarily align? Because you mentioned earlier about Brian, how he wants to be a team player, but obviously you guys are a company, but you're not the only company in the space. So how do you balance that approach?
Well, I do feel very strongly that no company has put aside its own parochial interest in crypto more than Coinbase in fighting on behalf of the industry. And obviously our loud and sustained calls for protecting DeFi is a very good example of that. But I would argue that our taking up the mantle and defending many token holders in our lawsuit was an even better example of that one. One could imagine a different strategy or course being taken by company in our position. But I also, at the same time, Ellie, recognize that we will not always be perfectly aligned with others in the industry, and so it's important that we be transparent about that, where we have a particular view that may benefit us in a way that may not be as applicable for others. The trades are an important way to reconcile all that. I think that CCI, Blockchain Association, and others have done a very good job of trying to forge a consensus in a somewhat fractious industry. I don't think any of you would disagree that we tend to be a somewhat loud and cantankerous bunch of crypto, but I think we've gotten much better over the last several years of forging an idea about how to find common ground, and I think Coinbase has done at least its part, if not more than that, to help make it out.
When it comes to the market structure bill, I'm curious if you are optimistic about it passing this year, and if so, what are kind of the top priorities that you would like to see come through from it, from Paul's perspective and Coinbase's perspective?
Well, Paul's perspective and Coinbase's perspective are one and the same on this one.
Okay, fair enough, yeah.
But look, I have opinions, as you guys know.
Right.
Look, I am an optimist when it comes to the market structure bill. I know I may stand separate and apart from some others in the industry who either are more skeptical and perhaps even eager to see just the stablecoin bill pass, for example, and nothing else. But the reason I'm optimistic is that we've now seen the White House be very clear that it expects to see a comprehensive bill passed this year. That was an early marker set down by the president himself. And I think members on both sides of the aisle in the Congress have taken that charge to heart. We've seen now Democrats join Republicans in passing each of these bills. I'll point here, for example, to the recent markup in the House Ag Committee on the Clarity Act. I mean, 3 dozen or more Democrats joined, with Republicans across that particular markup and the financial services markup. And so, I think we're seeing tangible evidence that it was a bipartisan consensus that we ought to see a market structure bill pass. I think the most important thing to come from the market structure bill is, first and foremost, spot market authority at the federal level, and in particular for the CFTC to have line of sight over these markets. I think it's critically important you finally define once and for all what transactions are securities transactions that are the responsibility of the SEC and what are not. I think there are a whole host of other issues regarding potential conflicts of interest and other things that will just give the markets more confidence that people can rely upon a durable framework when evaluating legal risks in this industry, just like they can in any other, and make their choices accordingly. So I hope we're going to see it all come together this year.
I also want to ask you about stablecoins. You brought that up, and that's an extremely popular sector right now, but also a very talked about one on the policy side. When it comes to stablecoins, both onshore and offshore, and the recent Circle IPO and everything else in between, how do you see that as an implication within the US market, and what are you keeping an eye on that's important to you?
Well, there's certainly a lot of excitement right now about stablecoins, and you've highlighted, I think, two recent examples of that, Circle IPO, and frankly, just the progress on the bill in the Senate as proof that if people start still asking themselves, what is the breakout use case for crypto? Well, I think we've seen it. Maybe Bitcoin is digital gold is the other competing example. But I think the thing about stablecoins that makes them so exciting and important, frankly, is they solve a real problem in our current financial system, which is it costs too damn much to move value from point A to point B. And that's as true for large institutions as it is for the regular retail customer or consumer. So I think we are going to see continued interest in stablecoins going forward. I think legislation will help accelerate adoption. And then, we can get on with the business of competing for the best solution for real consumers and real institutions. My personal view is that we will see with legislation especially many, many more participants in this market, people rushing in to offer their own stable coins or partner with existing stable coins to offer new products and services. And from Coinbase's perspective, as well as Paul's perspective, like you refer to myself in the third person, I think that's a good thing. I think we all win from that.
Right.
Yeah, I think as someone who's been going to the Hill the last couple of years, trying to interface with some of these legislators, it's been really refreshing on both of these pieces of legislation to see the level of sophistication in the conversation we're having, right? There's a level of engagement that I don't think we maybe got, 1 or 2 years ago. And then, we have kind of this window as the Virginia sort of chapter lead for Stand With Crypto. I'm very appreciative of the grassroots efforts that you guys have been doing. But it does seem like it's kind of now we're like maybe, right? So in terms of all the different kind of levers you guys can pull and the different efforts that are going on the Hill, what do you think we're looking at going into 2026? Do you think we're going to hit that August deadline? I mean, it looks like Genius will probably get across the finish line, but what are your thoughts on how we approach, maybe a shift going into in the next year?
Well, what I can say is this, because none of us really, I think one thing crypto has learned for this entire experience is that legislating is super hard and entirely unpredictable. But I will say that there is no reason why we can't and shouldn't have both the market structure bill and the stablecoin bill passed and enacted into law by the end of August. I think that if that were to happen, I think that Congress, frankly, could turn to other pressing matters outside of crypto that our country faces, and crypto can take the ball from there and sort out, all these issues to market competition that remain. But I think that were Congress to fail to do that, and if this were for some reason punted down the road yet again, look, I think everybody would lose. The people who love crypto would lose because we once again have to deal with uncertainty overheating this market, and many institutional investors and others saying, I'm still not quite confident enough to come into crypto, and liquidity suffers from that, and growth and investment suffers from that. And the people who hate crypto, I think, lose from this too, because it's never sort of been apparent to me why someone who is concerned about market risk, the risk of illicit finance using crypto, whatever the concern may be, why people with those priorities would say let's not put rules in place to prohibit that or restrict that in some way. I'm often fond of saying whether you love crypto, hate crypto, or feel somewhere in between, the answer is regulation and legislation.
Paul, we have a lot more to talk to you about, so we'll have you back. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to have you all here right now. Thanks.